The cerebral cortex can be divided into different lobes as well as different areas. We're going to focus on the different areas and their locations within each individual lobe. And we're going to also briefly describe the functions of each of our different areas in the cerebral cortex. So if I flip back 2 slides here, the cerebral cortex can be divided into a couple of different lobes. We've got the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, and then if you pull back the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, you'll then reveal the insular lobe. So frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and insular lobe. So we can talk about our cerebral cortex by dividing it into different lobes. We can also talk about the cerebral cortex in terms of the functional areas. So the cerebral cortex can be divided into motor areas, sensory areas, and association areas. So we're going to walk through each of the functional areas of the cerebral cortex, so the motor areas, the sensory areas, and the association areas. And we're going to talk about where each of these areas are located on the individual lobes. So first we'll focus on our motor areas. The motor areas are located on the frontal lobe. So all of our motor areas are located on that frontal lobe. There are 4 motor areas. There's the primary motor complex, the premotor complex, the Broca's area, and the frontal eye field. So all of these motor areas, the primary motor complex, premotor complex, Broca's area, and frontal eye field, are all located on the frontal lobe. We're going to walk through each individual area and briefly describe the function of that motor area. So the first motor area is the primary motor complex. So the primary motor complex, or the primary motor cortex, is shown right here. In our primary motor cortex, this functions for conscious control of precise or skilled voluntary movements of skeletal muscle. So the primary motor complex functions for conscious control of precise or skilled voluntary movements of skeletal muscle. Remember that the cerebral cortex is composed of interneurons. Interneurons communicate between sensory and motor neurons. The interneurons in the primary motor complex are communicating with these extremely large neurons called pyramidal neurons. Pyramidal neurons are going to have very long axons that are going to extend all the way down from the brain through the spinal cord in order to stimulate skeletal muscle and carry out that precise or skilled voluntary movement. So the primary motor complex is composed of interneurons that communicate with these very large these very large neurons called pyramidal cells. And those pyramidal neurons have very long axons. So those are going to be motor neurons that are then going to carry that motor output to skeletal muscle in order for you to carry out conscious control of precise and skilled voluntary movements. The body is represented on the primary motor cortex in proportion to the size and the number of motor units to that area of the body. When you're mapping the body and the central nervous system structures, this is known as somatotopy. So somatotopy is when we're mapping the body in these central nervous system structures. In other words, the body can be represented on the primary motor cortex in proportion to the size and the number of motor units to that area of the body. So for example, when you look over here, this is a motor map of your primary motor cortex. So this is showing you which regions of that primary motor cortex are dedicated to movements of specific structures. So for example, this whole region here in the primary motor cortex is going to be controlling movements of the thumb, the fingers, and the hand. So the thumb, the fingers, and the hand are shown much larger than some other body parts, which means that we have more motor units to that area of the body, most likely because we have very precise and skilled voluntary movements being carried out by our fingers and our thumb. So again, our body is represented on the primary motor cortex in proportion to the size and the number of motor units to that area. In other words, regions of the body that require or that carry out very precise or skilled movements are going to have a larger area of the primary motor cortex dedicated to that body part. So on this diagram, we can see that those body parts are shown larger, and this is a way that they're trying to indicate that there are greater motor units to that area of the body. Our next motor area is the premotor cortex. The premotor cortex is going to sit right in front of that primary motor cortex. Your premotor cortex functions to plan and coordinate movements. So it's going to help select and sequence basic motor movements into more complex tasks. So it selects and sequences basic motor movements into more complex tasks. And it also helps to coordinate all of the different muscle groups that carry out those movements. So the premotor cortex is going to make a plan and help to coordinate all of the muscles and movements. It's then going to send that plan to the primary motor cortex, which is then going to communicate with those large pyramidal motor neurons to actually carry out that motor output or carry out that skilled or precise voluntary movement. We also have the Broca's area. The Broca's area is going to be shown right here. The Broca's area is going to control muscles involved in speech production. We also have another motor area called the frontal eye field. The frontal eye field is going to control the voluntary movements of the eyes. So Broca's area controls muscles involved in speech production. Frontal eye field is going to control voluntary movements of the eyes. In addition to motor areas, we also have sensory areas. There are many, many different sensory areas in the parietal, temporal, insular, and occipital lobes. So our sensory areas cross the parietal, temporal, insular, and occipital lobes. So we're going to walk through each of these individual sensory areas. On the parietal lobe, we have the primary somatosensory cortex. The primary somatosensory cortex, shown here, is going to receive information from sensory receptors. So the primary somatosensory cortex is going to receive information from sensory receptors. Remember that sensory receptors are sensing a change in some variable, and then that sensory information is being sent to the brain via sensory neurons. So sensory neurons containing that sensory input or that sensory information are going to synapse with the interneurons of the primary somatosensory cortex. They're predominantly receiving sensory information from sensory receptors in the skin, as well as in muscles, joints, and tendons. So they're predominantly receiving sensory information from sensory receptors in the skin, as well as in the muscles, joints, and tendons. So the primary somatosensory cortex is going to receive sensory information from sensory receptors. So we can once again map the body on the somatosensory cortex based on the number of receptors or the density of receptors in that region of the body. So once again, we can actually map the body across that somatosensory cortex. The size of the body parts corresponds to the density of receptors or the amount of sensory information that that region of the brain is receiving. So for example, the lips are pretty large. There's actually a high density of sensory receptors in your lips. So you're receiving a lot of sensory information from that body structure. Same thing goes for your hands and your fingers. Our next sensory area on the parietal lobe is the somatosensory association area. So the somatosensory association area, shown right here, sits just behind that primary somatosensory cortex. It's going to take all of that sensory information and it's going to integrate it. So it's going to help you produce an understanding of all of the sensory information you've just received. So the somatosensory association area is going to receive all of that sensory input and integrate it or interpret it in order to produce an understanding of that sensory information. So for example, if you put your hand in your pocket and you have a set of car keys in your pocket, the sensory information is going to be sent to that primary somatosensory cortex, sensing maybe the shape, right, of that object, maybe the texture of that object. And then based on that sensory information that's received, the somatosensory association area is going to ultimately integrate that sensory information and try to make sense of it and be like, okay, so the object's irregularly shaped, it's kind of cold, so it's probably metal, it's very smooth. It's going to take all that information and it's ultimately going to produce an understanding of it in order to interpret that that sensory information is telling you this is a key that I have in my pocket. So it's going to ultimately call upon some past memories or past experiences in order to help produce an understanding of that sensory information. On the occipital lobe, we have two different sensory areas. We have the primary visual cortex and we have the visual association area. So both of these two sensory areas are associated with visual stimuli. So on the occipital lobe, our sensory areas are associated with vision. The primary visual cortex is going to receive visual information from the retina. So it's going to receive visual stimuli. The visual association areas are then going to use past experiences and past memories in order to interpret that visual stimuli. So interpret the colors, interpret the shapes, interpret the movements, and so on. So the primary visual cortex, shown here, is going to receive visual stimuli from the retina of the eye. And then surrounding that primary visual cortex, we're going to have the visual association area. And that's going to use past experiences in order to interpret visual stimuli, such as color, shapes, and movements. So our visual association areas are going to help you really recognize what you're seeing. The sensory areas on the temporal lobe are associated with hearing. So the sensory areas on your temporal lobe are predominantly associated with hearing. So you've got your primary auditory cortex and you've got your auditory association area. So you've got our primary auditory cortex shown here, and then surrounding it or sitting behind it, you've got that auditory association area. So these are both located on that temporal lobe and function for hearing. The primary auditory cortex is going to receive sensory input from hearing receptors. It's going to interpret sounds as pitch, loudness, and location. So the primary auditory cortex is going to receive sensory input from hearing receptors. It's going to interpret sounds as pitch, loudness, and location. The auditory association area is then going to permit perception of sound stimuli. So for example, it's going to call on past experiences or past memories you have of those sounds in order to assign meaning to that sound stimulus. So for example, if you have past memories where a scream indicated danger, if you heard a scream, that auditory association area would ultimately associate that scream potentially with danger. So it's going to help permit the perception of sound stimuli. Also located on our temporal lobe is going to be our olfactory cortex. So the primary olfactory cortex is going to receive sensory information from smell receptors in the nasal cavity. So our temporal lobe is functioning for hearing as well as functioning for smell. So the primary olfactory cortex is located on that temporal lobe, and the primary olfactory cortex receives sensory information from smell receptors in the nasal cavity, providing your conscious awareness of odors. On the insular lobe, we're going to have a couple of different sensory areas. We're going to have the gustatory cortex. The gustatory cortex is also known as the taste cortex because it functions to perceive taste stimuli. So the gustatory cortex or the taste cortex is a region involving the perception of taste stimuli. Next, we're going to have our visceral sensory area. The visceral sensory area is going to assist in conscious perception of visceral sensations. So visceral, you should always think your organs. So it's helping us interpret or perceive visceral sensations or organ sensations, such as an upset stomach or a full bladder. So our visceral sensory areas, our conscious perception of visceral sensations, such as an upset stomach or a full bladder. Lastly, our vestibular cortex is also known as our equilibrium cortex. That vestibular cortex or equilibrium cortex functions for conscious awareness of balance. So the insular lobe, which remember is located, if you were to pull back that frontal lobe, pull back that temporal lobe, so it's located underneath those regions. You can also see it in this diagram here. It's just deep to the temporal as well as that frontal lobe. You can see it in two different locations. That insular lobe is going to have the gustatory cortex, which functions for perceiving taste stimuli, the visceral sensory area, which is conscious perception of visceral sensations, and then the vestibular, the equilibrium cortex, which functions for your conscious awareness of balance. Lastly, we're going to have what are known as association areas. Association areas receive input from multiple senses, and then they send output to multiple areas. So they're going to receive sensory information from multiple sensory areas, and then it's going to send motor output or motor plans to multiple different motor areas. So multimodal association areas are ultimately going to cross a number of different lobes. And there are three different association areas. There's the anterior association area, the posterior association area, and then the limbic association area. So the anterior association area, posterior association area, and limbic association areas. So these multimodal association areas are going to have different functions. So our anterior association area is going to function with intellect, complex learning abilities or cognition, recall, and personality. So our anterior association areas are functioning for intellect, complex learning abilities or cognition, recall, and personality. Our anterior association areas also contain our working memory, which is going to be necessary for your ability to judge scenarios, reason, persist, as well as plan. So anterior association areas are also where our working memory is located. Our posterior association areas are going to function for recognition of patterns and faces, as well as localizing our surroundings in space. So our posterior association areas are trying to really tie all of our senses together and then make sense of all that sensory information. So posterior association areas, recognition of patterns, faces, and localizing our surroundings in space, or trying to tie all of our senses together. So briefly, you might have sensory information being sent to the primary sensory cortex, right? So for example, let's say visual stimuli might be sent to your primary visual cortex. So you're seeing some object. That information sent to the primary sensory cortex. It's going to take that information, interpret it. It's then going to send it to the visual association areas, which are going to help make sense of the visual stimuli. And then that interpretation of the visual stimuli is then going to be sent to the multimodal association cortex, specifically the posterior association areas, which are then going to tie that visual stimuli along with any other sensory information that it has received, right, such as potentially smell, right, or taste stimuli, in order to really make sense of where you're at, right? So we're trying to really tie all of those senses together. So kind of a basic flow of information could be going to the primary sensory cortex, sensory association cortex, then to the multimodal association cortex in order to really make sense of all of the sensory information that's been received. So multimodal association areas are really tying everything together. Lastly, the limbic association areas are going to assign emotional impact to the sensory information. So the limbic association areas are going to work with what's called our limbic system in the brain. It's going to provide emotional impact that's going to make a scene important to us, right? So it's going to assign an emotion to all of those senses. So like I mentioned before, if you associated screams with past dangerous memories, that emotional impact would come from the limbic association area. So you hear a scream, you interpret that scream as danger and fear.